Hybrid Cloud Show, Episode 13. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours and not those of our employers. Before we get into it, just a quick plug for a blog and little video demo that I put out there, which was on the Ubuntu Snapshot service and how you can build that into your systems management tooling. So probably not something that the general public would be that interested in, but maybe one or two of you who listen to this show. So I'll drop the link in the show notes.
I gave that a good read. It was pretty good. And actually, I read it and then I watched the YouTube video. So thank you for doing that.
So today I thought I would go through something with you that I end up talking to a lot of customers and partners about. And many people tell me that as a company, they have a strategy around cloud. And their cloud strategy is often SaaS first, PaaS second, and then IaaS if they can't find something in PaaS or SaaS that meets their requirements. And so I wanted to pick your brains about whether you thought that general strategy was sensible and what if you were a new CTO coming into a company, would have as your strategy. So let's start with that first piece. Software as a service as the priority, platform as a service as a secondary option, and if they can't satisfy the business requirement with either of those, moving into the infrastructure as a service space. What do you think of that as a general cloud strategy?
Am I a startup or am I in an established, company? How much money do I have in my budget, right? These all things are pretty important when trying to gauge, should I try to spin something up on my own or should I buy something as a service?
If we take that example, or take an example of what you described, let's say there's a company and they need to host files. And let's go through that little chain of things you've got there. So starting with software as a service, you might say, I'm going to use Dropbox. I'll just pay another company to deal with everything I need to do regarding hosting files. Whatever. Don't care. Don't want to do updates. Don't want to manage any of this. Don't want to handle security. Just pay someone else. Now let's pretend Dropbox was egregiously expensive. I don't know how much it is, but let's say, to Sean's point, if I'm a startup, maybe I don't have enough money for Dropbox. Again, replace Dropbox with something else. Maybe you go down platform as a service, which would be something like maybe Heroku, Google App Engine, and that you find a way to use a very strong abstraction layer, an opinionated abstraction layer maybe, to self-host that. So I'm going to spin up an FTP server using very, as I say, opinionated Heroku with plenty of guardrails, etc., to roll it out. Let's say Heroku is too expensive. Maybe you want to then go down infrastructure as a service. That might be EC2 or Google Compute Engine or something else, and roll that out yourself. Or maybe put it on Hetzner or some other cheap box to get that file hosting. I think that's sort of, when you describe this issue, that's sort of what I envision in my head would be the sort of problem you might have. Is that how we understand it?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting summary of it, because that's effectively, I think, going through that same rationalization. In an ideal world, you'd buy that service, and then if there's a reason not to, then you move down the layers. And it's interesting to me because I think in the beginning, a lot of people were thinking about replacing the boxes in their data centers. And so it was much more common to come into it thinking infrastructure as a service first and then growing those layers on top. But it's interesting that you come at it from that perspective, that you would think, what's my business problem to solve? And then if that's too expensive or, there's a problem with it, I go down a layer and try and solve those problems further down.
I'd almost tackle it slightly differently to that. And the decision for me comes down to, do I build something or do I buy something? And in that case, you sort of get rid of the PaaS and IaaS question, because that almost becomes less relevant if you're building a solution right. If you're thinking about I want to host files for my business, do I just pay Google or Dropbox or someone to do that, where I know they've already got the highly available storage and the economies of scale play in? Or do I want to spend the time building that myself and implementing high availability and paying for all the storage and everything else? And the decision there very easily becomes, buy something, right? We all upload these files to Google Drive once we're done, and not a Nextcloud server that Joe runs for us, because clearly that's the easier thing to do.
He's got a point. But also, I would definitely upload to my Nextcloud if I had the opportunity.
I think to go back to the original question of if I was a CTO, you're a CTO of a business that presumably needs to exist and be providing some unique value that no one else can provide. And what I, as a CTO, would not want to be worrying about is things that are already solved. So I'm going to look at buying as much as possible, and where there is constraints in the organization that prevent me from buying that might be financial reasons, that might be regulatory reasons, then I will, as a last ditch effort, then go lower down that list of decisions. Again, it's buy versus build. But again, I think CTOs probably have a lot on their minds and don't want to be thinking about FTP servers anymore. So I would always lean towards what you've basically described. It sounds like your customers are going down that path as well, which is buy versus wherever you can. Don't think about these things because they will haunt you. Even oftentimes if it's a bad idea, like you see a lot of these supply chain attacks that happen because you've bought something and then put all your eggs in one basket. And to some extent, like if that's happened, you're not going to be the only person to suffer that. At least maybe with a third-party supplier, you can kind of offset some of the responsibility on them and say, well, sorry, my customers, but our supplier screwed up. You know, that responsibility isn't on the CTO. What's to say you'd come up with a more secure solution than a third-party supplier? Like, I think there is a lot of passing the buck and commoditizing, if you know what I mean.
Yes, I think there's a question of what do you as a business want your unique value to be? Like, what are you adding to this infrastructure to turn it into a business? And, you know, you can do that by just putting together a bunch of other people's SaaS solutions and turn that into something that didn't exist before. But I think there's also situations where some piece of infrastructure might be core enough to your business that that's the area that you want to innovate in, and that's where you dig in and do your own build piece of the equation.
Well, you often hear the phrase removing the undifferentiated heavy lifting from things, don't you? So if you think about something like running an FTP server in Shane's example, it's pretty well known that you probably shouldn't be doing that. But if you do that, then there are 1,000,001 people who have a template to set up an FTP server and do it in, I guess, the right way. Similarly, with something like a database, your business value is not, we run Postgres really well, unless it is, and that's great, but there are also other companies that do that. Your business value is whatever thing you build on top of Postgres. So the value there isn't you spinning up a Red Hat box and doing yum install Postgres, right? Your value is your actual application. So let someone else deal with the yum install Postgres and the patching and the managing of the storage layer underneath and everything. And that, I guess, is when you then move to a PaaS model.
We probably take it for granted among the four of us that if we were building something, even then we wouldn't be sitting down and trying to write ourselves a web server or whatever. You know, we would be building on the best open source that was out there, even if we were doing, quotes, build.
Well, I mean, if I was building a static website, I'd just be throwing it on S3 or something. There's no way that you'd catch me running a Linux box with the website on. That's just pointless. Anyone can run a web server for a static site at this point.
There is a slight difference, though, between can and wants to and whether it's economic to do so, right? Like, I mean, you do pay a premium for people to run services for you. So don't you reach a scale if you are doing something enough that actually you do want to bring some of these things that you previously were buying as SaaS or buying as PaaS in-house so that you can either gain those economies of scale or that you can gain more control over your own destiny or more customization or those sorts of things?
I think there probably are economies of scale, but I think that most businesses are unlikely to reach those economies of scale particularly quickly. And when you do reach that scale, I guess the ability to outsource some of the running of that and have some kind of enterprise level of support around it actually becomes more of a feature than we're running our own database on premises or something.
It's a good question. Like when does that happen? Like, let's say, again, in my fictitious Dropbox example, you're paying an engineer's salary in Dropbox every year. Is it still a bad idea to move off Dropbox and have an engineer think about this problem? Is there like inherent benefits to saying, no, I want to take this in-house. I want to understand this problem more. I feel like I want to have control over this area of our technology. What are the things that you need to think about and consider when making that decision?
Yeah, I've seen it in a few places. I've seen it where there is a particular element of something that someone wants to customize that just isn't available in the common SaaS offerings or PaaS offerings. Maybe it's, I don't know, Postgres that's hosted for you, and you need a particular extension for Postgres that they're not offering as part of that managed service. And so if you want that extension, you need to run that yourself effectively. And so I've seen people going down a layer, as I think of it, to do that themselves. But I've also seen people to do it so that they've got a bit more control and vendor neutrality and can run exactly the same thing in multiple places. That's another reason I see people running something that is not a PaaS service or a SaaS service, so that they've got control and they can do that wherever they want to run it.
That sounds like a sensible approach and a sensible reason to not completely buy into SaaS. I mean, you do hear of the horror stories of Google deleted my account and my entire business shut down, or my AdWords account was shut down, so we can't connect traffic to the site anymore. Decoupling yourself from that risk is probably sensible where possible.
To answer the other piece of your question of whether there is sort of logical places or times or costs or whatever that you need to meet before these things make sense, one of the areas I've seen that is when you're talking about an infrastructure technology that really needs to be supported 24/7. And so you really need to be running enough of that infrastructure to pay for a 24/7 workforce of engineers who are going to support that for you. And that, obviously raises the buy-in cost, but then the incremental cost can be lower.
Is there sometimes a risk with PaaS, maybe not PaaS, maybe SaaS, where you've invested in this commodity, we'll say, I'm going to pay for Dropbox, but then you've had to engineer maybe suboptimal systems around that because you've made this decision early on and it's hard to undo. You don't have the skills anymore. Like, as a CTO, I suppose I would be thinking about that as well. Like, where is there a long-term risk of this being a bad decision, and is it reversible? It's where when you talk about, like, can we be vendor agnostic? Yeah, I feel like that's a sensible tactic.
Yes, I remember coming across somebody, I think in Cambridge, a guy named Dr. Mark Thompson, and I've mentioned this somewhere, I don't think it was on this podcast, but I met this guy and he did a lot of work in government procurement and how governments should buy big software stuff because often they don't end up getting great value for money. And so one of the things he talked about, if I remember correctly, was having sensible interfaces. So making sure that between the pieces, the components, you have a sensible common standard or a piece that the industry understands that sits in between those. So maybe in your Dropbox example, you would standardize around the sort of S3 MinIO, those sorts of things, as opposed to something that was proprietary to Dropbox and then trying to build all of your infrastructure talking this proprietary protocol.
I mean, that's always the way that I've looked at building hybrid cloud environments, right? Is you abstract away from the vendor-specific thing as much as you possibly can. Say, S3, I guess, is a pretty well-understood language at this point, so that isn't so much of a problem because you can move to something like MinIO, like you said, Aaron. But things like, when you're choosing a database engine, make sure that if you wanted to move away from your managed serverless database, that you could take the database and move it to your own Postgres or your own MySQL, or even better, abstract that away in some kind of API layer. So you're just calling your API to get the data. All of your applications call that API in a standardized way to get data. And actually, then the only place you have to change that if you were to switch out the engine entirely would be just at the API layer. And then you're just returning the data in a pretty standardized way to the applications. So I think it is something that you have to think about as a CTO, but it's also something that you have to really drill into those people architecting those solutions, that you don't want to get stuck in a place where you're using vendor A's serverless database service or whatever.
I think that gets trickier when you're interacting with SaaS in particular, because they can often be helpful to some extent, but very opinionated and may not provide open standards for you to interface with. S3 is a great example, but Dropbox may not have a S3 compatible layer. So then you start building translation layers around that perhaps, and then it gets more complicated than it needs to be. But I would agree, yeah, you want to de-risk yourself, but at the same time, you might eliminate SaaS as an option.
But maybe that also factors into your decision of SaaS vendor, right? Maybe you do choose the ones that have the more industry standard protocols or formats.
Or you don't. Or you choose the opinionated ones because they add an advantage that your business needs. That's the value is there for that.
Yeah, it depends on the trade-offs you want to make. Maybe you don't foresee that Dropbox is going to be part of any business logic at any point, and it's just a place you're putting sales documents or HR things or whatever, at which point you're probably not going to integrate that into the application, so it doesn't matter. But when you're thinking about, I've got 20 terabytes of JPEGs that are being uploaded from a vendor that I then need to pull into some kind of management system, maybe you do want to standardize on something like SFTP. Then you could SaaS host it, or you could use PaaS and have some kind of PaaS SFTP shim that's uploading the files to S3 for you, or you could just run your own SFTP server. That's probably a slightly better example, I would say, than Dropbox, where you're likely to just be storing standard business documents and contracts and things.
Or just shove it all in Salesforce and never think about this ever again, maybe.
I was literally hired to get us out of Salesforce. So you're bringing them nightmares.
Did they pick open standards and it's all really easy adoption to migrate off, yeah?
Oh, yeah. It's super easy. I don't have a custom library or anything.
Yeah. That's the thing. Like, you've got the software as a service want you to remain forever paying those subscription fees. So, yeah, pick your vendors wisely because they may act against your interests to keep you tethered.
So we've talked a bit there about tooling for applications or line of business, but what about those supporting functions for things? So I'm thinking stuff like CI platforms and things like that do become part of your critical business application, but actually might at some point become a blocker to innovation because you're worried about your CI bill being too expensive to experiment with running ARM64 images or something like that. How do we feel about using a software as a service platform for those supporting development components?
Try to make them reversible decisions. I have felt a lot of pain with a certain CI/CD platform, which will remain nameless, where effectively the configuration file is in every single of our several thousand repos, and undoing that decision would be a nightmare of pain. Whereas there may have been an option to script something where there are things not in several thousand repos, and this could have been a trivial piece of effort. So try to make that a reversible decision, but it's going to depend on how much you have faith in that product to continue to innovate, but also sustain the things you need as a business going forward.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, right? Like, I've been burned several times by those CI or platform as a service type functions where it's great because it lets me get my image builds running really easily, or has certain plugins I can pull in for interacting directly with AWS or insert cloud vendor here. But the barrier to entry might be lower, but longer term, I'm then worried about, can I build this image, or is it going to burn through too many credits, or how does this function work? Oh, they haven't implemented that, so I have to wait. And it just becomes a bit of a nightmare, doesn't it?
Some people need to be on, well, I use need in a very loose term there, but there are some companies that see value in being on particular sites, GitHub being an obvious one, where companies choose to be on GitHub because other people are on GitHub, the classic network effect. So I think that's a hard one to quantify. Beyond that, though, I think, there are always challenges with buying into a platform at an organizational level because unpicking that gets so difficult. So the more systemic it is across more teams, then the more challenges there are anytime you have to change that. It goes back to your point before around, can you make it so that only one team is interacting with it so that you can remove it more easily in the future?
Going back to the CTO question, like, is this product, and I say this as an important, like, is this going to continue to innovate? Like, dev best practices will change in the future. And if that platform can't keep up with that, your ability to innovate and succeed as a business might be at risk because of something as trivial as your CI platform sucks. So it's important to think about these things.
How do you protect yourself against that?
Again, it's trying to like minimize the impact, make reversible decisions. Don't put files in every repo. Never do that. If you can avoid it, or put your own abstraction layer in there and translate that to the cloud provider of choice, so that you own the abstraction layer. There doesn't have to be thousands of changes to make this change. You're dropping the change in underneath the hood, and no one even knows the difference, if possible.
It's tough because we're operating at two levels here. We're talking about CTO level decisions here. At the same time, deciding which files to put in a repo, like that's an individual contributor level. So I can tell you, okay, use build scripts that are specific to your CI platform, but are actual just bash scripts, right? That way you can just run them anywhere and they always work. That's an individual contributor level. Or I can tell you, at very much how Shane said, at a CTO level, I'm trying to come up with some sort of abstraction layer that we can just easily reverse or limit the impact of a decision like that. But the more critical the platform, the harder it's going to be to switch. That's just the nature of the beast.
You're also limiting yourself in a way to not using those features that that provider is offering. If you're trying to keep vendor neutral, then the trade-off with that being you can't use the nice ergonomics of that platform's tooling, and you can't do those things that the platform very much makes easier for you to hook you in. So there are trade-offs there as well in terms of the efficiency of the platform you've chosen. How much do you want to abstract the benefits of the platform you've chosen to keep yourself neutral in the future?
And there's a question of how much you want to invest in putting a translation layer around all these products as well. Like at some point, maybe we just roll it ourselves. It's going to be easier. It's a fair point. Like I'm thinking about things like GitHub workflows. Git, you can migrate off to a different provider, no bother, but all the niceties that GitHub provides you, well, that's all vendor specific. And I don't know what the translation layer to GitLab is like for that, or if it's even possible.
You could, or you could use a third-party CI/CD tool, and instead of using stuff like Dependabot, use Renovate. These things that are platform agnostic. There's some wiggle room.
I guess to Aaron's point, that might still lose you some nice vendor-specific features.
And I think that brings you back to the question of what kind of company are you the CTO of? A CTO of a startup probably is less concerned about vendor lock-in and more concerned about what's the quickest, easiest way that we can go and get running with this thing and find market fit and get a product out there, versus a CTO of a large enterprise that might be looking to move out of a contract at the end of the 3-year agreement period or something, or might want to commit less because they can see that a business is coming up on a troubling time. So I think those attitudes vary massively depending on what kind of a company you're the CTO of.
It may also make a difference in the size of the company because focus may be more or less important. If you're a startup, then you're not going to want to have your 2 engineers or whatever building a CI/CD platform. You're going to want them building whatever it is you want to bring to the market as your unique value. Whereas if you're a giant multinational company and you're looking at a bill that's going out every month of, I don't know, $10 million or something, then maybe having a team that's trying to replace that with an in-house solution makes a bit more sense.
So if we come full circle, is the answer just, it depends?
Haven't you realized yet that's what this show does?
So caveat the it depends, like even as a startup, you could put a tiny amount of effort into, if I am successful and find product market fit, will I hate this decision I just made? And maybe you will, and that's just something you have to accept. But maybe there's some little easy to put in middle layer that's just a script that makes your life a little easier. Like, so just thinking a little about that. Is this a reversible decision? Don't spend a lot of time on it. Obviously, you've got to make sure your business actually succeeds and is viable. But you know what I mean? There's a little bits you could do just to ease that pain for yourself in the future.
I do wonder if we are going to sound like we're saying almost the opposite of what I think we believe, in that it sounds to me like everyone's putting some caveats on the benefits of taking a SaaS solution or a PaaS solution and saying, sure, do it, but these are the things you should be careful about. None of us are approaching this saying, well, absolutely, you should go and build all your infrastructure from scratch, from the IaaS layer up. It's more, okay, fine, these are the things you should do to protect yourself when you're going from the service or platform level down.
Yeah, it's risk reward, really. And it's up to you to kind of understand your business and understand the potential future needs and make the best decision you can. It'll be wrong, whatever it is, but it's whatever might minimize the pain for yourself or the next CTO in the future.
The goal is to be more right than you are wrong. And CTOs, anybody, just they come and go. A lot of times somebody who's the right CTO for a startup is not the same CTO for some well-established company. Knowing what decisions to make at what time is tough, and that's something you really learn from experience and plenty of time.
So be the CTO who starts it, makes all the wrong decisions, and then gets out for the next CTO to clean everything up. Basically, is the best advice.
Only if you have a golden parachute.
Yeah.
Yeah, all your options are vested, right? Well, it's probably time for us to wrap this up. But before I do, I just want to say thank you to our existing PayPal supporters and our patrons. If you'd like to join those people, you can at hybridcloudshow.com/support, where for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an ad-free feed, either of just this show or all the Late Night Linux family shows. Sometimes you even receive episodes early. Please do remember to pass on the show details if you've got a friend who likes hybrid clouds. And if you've got any questions or feedback, please send those in to show@hybridcloudshow.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
See you later.